Hello, Advanced Programming. We have been working on a Tic Tac Toe networked sketch. I am working on the server half of it, and if I press run, you'll see that I don't have a lot going on yet, but some pretty critical things. I can click and add one particular symbol in the project, but we're not quite. We only have one. I want to do X's and O's, so I guess I'm doing Gryffindor and Slytherin as my X's and O's, but currently I can only add one, and that actually is the intention for the server. I'm going to consider the server as Gryffindor. And I'm actually not sure if I spelled Gryffindor right. Please don't hate me. So Gryffindor is going to be the symbol the server will put down. It's kind of like, the server's always going to be X, the client's always going to be O type of thing. And I'm only going to be programming the server side. You're going to work on the client side, but rest assured that a lot of the code will be mirrored over. The network stuff, of course, as we've discussed, will be different, and you have lots of material from my previous lessons, and you can check that video that I uploaded as well in case you've forgotten about the differences in the server networking and the client networking program code. So yeah, enjoy that. But in making this program, we've done a lot of work. We've done a lot of work just to make this simple tic-tac-toe thing happen. I guess the main things that we've been working on are working with a 2D array. So creating a 2D array that will represent sort of have we clicked on different spaces, and we made this 2D array an int array. So the int array will contain zeros, and zeros will represent you've not taken a move. And then we're adding two more values. One will represent Gryffindor or X's, and two will represent O's or Slytherin in my case. But you can choose whatever pictures you want, of course. But that's why we need an int. It can't just be true or false, because there's three possible values. It's X, O, or not taken yet. So that's the story of what's going on there. We have, just like our last project, we have our server, my server objects for handling the network communications, and we have our incoming and outgoing strings. This is how we're sending information across the network. And I think strings were fairly obvious when we sent text-based messages in the chat programs we wrote, but it's also the way you send any kind of information. So we'll see how we can send numbers across the network as well using strings. So nothing too exciting here compared to the last project for the most part. We initialize our strings to the empty string, and then we create our server with our consistent port number. This is a little bit new. Here we are instantiating the 2D array, and we're just saying it's going to be 3 rows and 3 columns large. That's a really important step because now the grid is set up and it's full of zeros, 9 zeros to be precise, and it has sort of those dimensions. We'll load our images as well. Here's, I guess I did, well, assuming that's spelled correctly as well, I guess I did spell it right. Woohoo! You'll have to load both the X's and O's pictures because you'll have to also display the opponent's moves on here. So even though you can't click and add X's in the server, you'll have to show your opponent's O's. So eventually you'll have to load whatever your O image is as well. So in the draw function has a fairly interesting loop in here. First of all, I draw the good old lines of tic-tac-toe, the crisscross lines to make the grid visible. And then I have a lovely loop that will basically go through our 2D array. It's going to do what's called row major order, so it's going to scan across the rows and then go down to the columns. And each time I'll just take a look. Row and column start at 0, 0, so the top left corner. I'll just check to see if it's a 1, I'll draw an X. And if it's a 2, I'll draw an O. I don't have the O loaded yet, so that'll be fine. I'll go to the next column, and then that will, for the most part, be fine. I'll just loop again and go, do it again for the next box over. But if I get to the end of the row, if I get to column is 3, then I know I've gone sort of beyond the end of the row, so I need to go back to the beginning of the row and go to the next row. So this while loop will sort of basically go through and display the X's and O's, or the empty space, if the case may be. Notice that there's no if it equals 0. If it equals 0, it just does nothing, or any other number for that matter. You'll notice that there's some math going on here. In order to figure out sort of what place to draw the X's and O's, I'm just using their row and column information and multiplying by 100. Why 100? Well, my sketch is 300 by 300. And I have a 3 by 3 grid, so that allots 100 pixels in terms of width and height to our grid. So the math is just dividing the size by 3. And if you made a different size sketch, then you could, whatever that number is, divide it by 3. Hopefully you chose a number that's easily divisible by 3 to make your life easy. So like 600 or 450 or something that is nicely divisible by 3. And that's, I'm just forcing it to be 100 by 100 because that's the size of my grid, but you can force it to be whatever size works out for your individual squares in your tic-tac-toe box. So that's going on for that math. So that's me showing the X's and O's that are contained inside of the grid. I'm going to skip over the networking stuff for now, and I'm just going to show you how do we get the X's into the grid. And that's in the mouse pressed function. So there's some short amount of code in here. It's not very long, but it is fairly awesome code, I would say. Not that I'm like, oh, I wrote such good code, but it's just really cool that Java and processing have this feature. Here's how I find the row and column. Any particular mouse coordinate I click on, I just have to divide it by 100 in order to figure out what corresponding row and column I am accessing. So I'll just run the program. Now, for example, if I click in, anywhere in this square, if I click here, or I click here, 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 it'll work out to 0, 0, the row and column. If I click over here, in this one here, this is going to be column 0, row 2. Anywhere I click in these coordinates, this math here, this division I'm doing, dividing by 100, will give me row 2, column 0. And it works because when you divide an integer by an integer in processing, it ignores the remainder. It just tells you exactly how many times does 100 go into the numerator, I suppose, evenly. So like, if this is 300 and, well, I guess it can't be 329. It was 229, and we divided it by 100. We're not going to get 2.29. We're going to get just plain old 2, which is exactly what we want to break this mouse coordinate, where there's so many possible coordinates to click within any particular box, into just the row and column of the box out in the grid. And then once we have that information, I'm just assigning it a 1. And only 1s happen in the tic-tac-toe server. The client will assign 2s. And that's what makes it so that, when I go to show the grid in the draw function, I now have 1s that will then begin, showing those particular images at those coordinates. I think that's one of the hardest things about this project, is just differentiating between the coordinates of, say, the mouse or the coordinates of the screen and the row and column coordinates of the grid. Even just keeping the grid separate from the screen is fairly challenging. So keep on asking questions if you're struggling with that. I'll mention the networking stuff now, which will be important. Here I am packaging up that row and column as a string and then sending it across the network. This is pretty fantastic because I can then send the move that I made. Not only did I make it on my grid, but I can send it across the network so that the client can also record that move and stick a 1 in the client's version of the grid. And that way they'll stay synchronized. That information will propagate across the network. And also, in my draw function, I am reading incoming messages so that when the client makes a move and writes a 2 in its grid, presumably it will similarly send across that information. And if I read an incoming message, I can also put a 2 into the grid in that position. You'll notice the message I'm sending is basically row, comma, column. So if I click on 0, 2, I'll send across 0, comma 2, comma 2. This will be the format of the message. So there's going to be, in the next video, I'll show how is it that we can decode that string, because a string isn't a number, and it's going to be a little bit complicated to make that happen. So we'll see that in a moment, not long from now. Okay, thanks everybody for seeing how to get this project started.